produced in a given year. And this used up capital comprises circulating capital, which is the raw materials and ancillary products, as well as the wages. But there is also an element of depreciation. So some of the value of the fixed capital, that is the buildings and machines, also gets passed over during the course of a year. So that's the second amount of capital, which must be less than the total capital advanced. And then there's a third amount which is relevant here, which the second amount really distinguishes between fixed capital and circulating capital. But then the third amount is really to do with how quickly that circulating capital actually circulates. So the more turnover there is in a year, the less circulating capital needs to be advanced, because it keeps coming back and it returns and is thrown back into the process. And this amount that's thrown into the process Marx calls the capital applied, which is the amount of capital actually used up in one turnover. So you have three different categories of amounts of capital. Now, this is actually really important when it comes to defining the denominator, the underneath division sign, in terms of the rate of profit. And the rate of profit is surplus value over capital advance. So how much capital advance are we talking about? Are we talking about the first, second, or third of these amounts? And what Marx is talking about is the first amount. So in other words, the rate of profit is calculated based on the total capital advanced. It's the surplus value divided by the total capital advanced. And it's quite important, this, because it's a different amount than the value of the commodities that are produced in the year. And the notation that Marx uses is potentially misleading on this, because the small c of C plus V plus S, which we've become accustomed to, which is the C of the constant capital, which is passed over to commodities when they're produced. It's part of the value product. That C is quite different to the other C, which is the constant capital, which is tied up with the factory and the fixed capital at the infrastructure of the process. And it's that second C, which is the one that matters for the rate of profit. So there is difference between the total capital advanced and the capital which is used up and passes directly over to the commodities. There's another quite minor correction, but just to record it, because it's actually significant and when we go forward. Marx does not introduce the differentiation of profit rates by sector in part one. He's only analysing it at the level of the individual capital. He does come to it, what you could call an aggregate or an average rate of profit by sector in part two. Now, what I've gone through in the last slide is a bit complicated, so I'll just put in another slide which uses Marx's figures from the very opening of volume 3 to try to explain by example a bit more fully what he's talking about. So if you had a total capital of 1,680, I think the multiplier is something of the region of 200. So that would be like, about £2 million today, I think. Basically, you've got an element which is the fixed capital, 1,200. That's again our big machines, the infrastructure of the factory. And he says that of this fixed capital, some £20 is passed over into commodity value as depreciation. As it happens, that's a very low rate of depreciation. It's like it would take 60 years on a straight line to get all the fixed capital's value passed over to commodities. More typically, it's about 10 years or so, maybe 30 years for buildings and 10 years for machines. But I think that's based on real figures that he was given, and so he sticks with it. So that's a depreciation. Now, what you've also got is circulating capital, £100 on wages and £380 on raw materials, ancillary materials, etc. So basically, the capital that goes over into the commodity is worth £500, and the commodity value is £600. So we have a surplus value of £100. So the commodity value is 100V, 400C, and 100S. So the commodity value is 600. It cost 500, but its value is 600. Therefore, surplus value is 100, and this is a rate of surplus value of 100%. So that's Marx's example at the beginning of volume 3. And he calls this an excess at this point of £100. It's just the initial point in his discussion. And what he doesn't go on to say, but is strongly implicit in his figures, is what the rate of profit would actually be on that example. So here, remember that the rate of profit, and this is the important point that I want to sort of underline at this stage, is the surplus value over the total capital advanced. So the rate of profit in our example will be 100 divided by 1,680, i.e. just under 6%, and not 100 divided by, say, 500, which is just the capital passed over to the commodities. You have to think of it in terms of the return that the capitalist gets for their total investment, okay, rather than the margin on the commodities, or rather it's a distinct ratio, and it's fundamentally the ratio that they're concerned with. I'm also going to summarize this or go over this again because it is so important going forward. Let me just start here. The rate of profit then is the annual surplus value over the total capital. We'll call this big C, following Marx, okay? Now, the annual surplus value can be conceived of as the annual rate of surplus value. If we divide surplus value by variable capital, we get S over V, which is the annual rate of surplus value. But if we divided the top of this ratio by variable capital, then we should also divide the bottom to be consistent. So we also divide the total capital by the variable capital. Now, why should we do that? By doing this, it allows us to see the different elements that go into making up the rate of profit. So if the rate of surplus value, the annual rate of surplus value is the rate of surplus value times the number of turnovers in a year. That's the top of the division, and the bottom of the division is this C plus V over V, the total capital over the variable capital. Marx's notation again, he calls the rate divided V into C and into V, we get C over V plus 1. This all sounds very technical, algebraic, and so on, but it's just if you like, a proof, if I can use that term, of the conclusion that conceptually we've already drawn, which is that the rate of profit is given by the combination of the rate of surplus value, the number of turnovers of capital in a year, and is divided by the organic composition of capital plus 1. And in the figures that Marx typically uses, we say that in percentage terms, the rate of surplus value is 100. We would say that the turnover might be, say, 2 times a year, the in machinery, and at 20 in wages, plus 1, and that comes out at 40%. So the rate of surplus value is 100%, the rate of profit is 40%. But what Marx has given us is how the one becomes the other at the level of the individual capital. Now, what I want to do now is move from volume 3, part 1 into part 2. And quite a lot of this you're very familiar with already. what I'm just indicating here is some major inputs from volume 1 and volume 2. But our main area of concern here is how part 1 turns into part 2. So Marx carries over the variable of organic composition of capital into his analysis in part 2. He carries over the turnover of capital into part 2. But at the very beginning of part 2, he denies, or if you like, limits the scope of his solution to these problems by saying that the rate of surplus value will not change. He says this, he justifies this in terms of he's looking at the system as though it's the capital within one country, and all the workers within one country will be exploited to the same degree. There's a tendency to convergence, he believes, of workers in one country, because the workers